in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make a different type of fabric paper. This is going to be a little different than what you did in the previous tutorial. This is really great for collage material if you want to make some really unique collage material for your mixed media pieces. What's really fun about this is that you can do a variety of different things in this paper. So for example, you can actually add cheesecloth in here, and I'm going to show you how to do this. We actually put embroidery floss in the paper as well. What's great too is that you can incorporate different types of plants like rose petals or flower petals. You can even put lavender petals in there. I've seen people put skeleton leaves in here because you are similar to the last video. You're going to be sandwiching two pieces of tissue paper instead of cheesecloth, and you can put all sorts of things in between this tissue paper. Like for example, I sandwiched these little pieces of Asian writing, and also, you can, like I said, you can put different types of cheesecloth in between. And then what's fun is that once you have these papers done, like this is the back of it, you can then add acrylic paint onto the surface to create these really different looks. And you can tell, like this one is sort of more of a pinkish look, and the fun thing is you can add color to this. This actually, for example, was originally the tissue paper was lavender, and then I added black paint on there. On the back I added more blue and turquoise, and you can see that it really transforms the look of this fabric paper. So another thing you can do is, like I said, you can use this for collaging in your mixed media pieces. This piece I incorporated in this art journal, and it just really has a different look compared to this one. So I wanted to show you some examples of how this fabric paper looks. And the fun part of this is that it doesn't matter what type of tissue paper you use. You can use like regular tissue paper. I use the tissue paper that the sewing patterns are printed on. That kind of gives a different look. And like I said, you could use colored tissue paper. And also, in this one the whole thing was actually mulberry paper. And that also provided a very different look. So this is really a fun technique, and it's very different from the other video, so this is going to be fun. So let's get started. Okay, so now you have your silicone mat or your saran wrap on your surface. I've cut out 2 pieces of tissue paper, and I'm actually going to use this one for the bottom so you can see a little bit more clearly on the camera. But you want to make sure that these are pretty close to the same size. And then what you're going to do is you are going to start to cut your embroidery floss. And we're going to have 4 strands down. And you can cut them a little longer than the actual paper so that you can have them hanging off the edge. I'm going to put those at the top, and then you want to cut also 4 strands vertical. And then just put that to the side. And then you want to start to apply your acrylic medium, and we're going to start at the top here and just generously apply 2 rows of that matte medium directly on to the paper. And you want to make sure that you're also not pushing too hard, because as soon as the matte medium hits the paper, it'll start to get really delicate. And then what you want to do is get your embroidery floss and just place that directly over the paper. And you don't have to have this completely straight or perpendicular. You can actually have the strands a little bit crooked, and even a little bit of curls is fine. That gives it an organic look, which is very cool. So I'm putting another application, and then I'm going to add my embroidery floss. Also, you want to add a little bit to the top of your embroidery floss just to get it in position so it stays. And again, you're really lightly applying this layer of Mod Podge or acrylic medium to the tissue paper so that you don't tear it. And then you want to apply your final application of the acrylic medium to the bottom. And then you're going to take your vertical embroidery floss and begin to apply that vertical. Now I'm also going to add a little bit of cheesecloth to this, but first I'm going to just make sure that I have these embroidery floss in position. So I'm adding a little bit of more acrylic medium over that. So I'm going to add some cheesecloth in some areas. What I find is that this adds a little bit of character to your paper, but it also creates something that you can grab onto when you start to remove the page from your surface. And then I'm also going to add a little bit of collage material in here too. Now at this stage, this is when, if you wanted some flower petals or any plants in there, dried leaves, whatever, is when you would actually apply that to this layer. Okay, so, and at this stage. So now you want to take your top layer and you just want to gently press down, because your bottom layer is pretty wet, so you want to be very careful at not tearing that. And I find that just patting it down with your hands first is really good. And then what you're going to do is you're going to take your brush and gently brush over that and try to just outline the embroidery floss, which will close up the gap. It's almost like getting rid of any excess air in there. So what I'm doing is I'm forcing the tissue paper to hug that embroidery floss by just outlining it. I'm also adding a little bit more matte medium to it. And this seems to go right through the tissue paper. If you find that you need a little bit underneath, also, especially where the cheesecloth is, you can add more. But I am trying to get rid of that air pockets that's caused by the floss. So that's what I'm doing. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and dry this with a hairdryer. And you want to make sure that you dry the top layer as much as you can before you start to separate the paper from the surface. So the surface is starting to dry, but I can still really feel there's a lot of moist areas. But what I'm doing as I'm drying is it's kind of just pushing some of this down. Because the top is starting to dry, it's less likely to tear. Just make sure you avoid rubbing any areas that are wet, because that will tear the tissue. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start separating this from the actual mat or the work surface. And I'm going to get air underneath that so that it can slowly separate that. And what you want to happen is you want to make sure that bottom layer is completely adhered to the top layer. And you can slowly separate the edges. That's really the hard part is separating the edges. Because once you get the edges up, you can then get air underneath that. So now I got that separated, which is perfect, and now I can go ahead and dry the back, get that dried, and then I can also turn it over and keep drying it. So I'm going to add a little bit of color to this now that it is completely dried, just so that I have a little bit of some more interest happening. And you can use any color on this. Sometimes you can even paint this entire thing white, and just to have kind of that sort of minimalistic look, but I wanted to show you what happens when you add some color to your piece and it just starts to transform. And it also picks up some of the texture from the string. And then I'm going to dry that. And what I'm going to show you is with a dry brush technique, which means that you're putting very little paint on your bristle, very little. You're going to glide that right over some of the areas, which will actually bring out some of the texture and the high points of your embroidery string. And this will give your paper a little bit more interest and texture. So this is really a fun technique to do. And you can do this with metallic as well. That also brings up sort of the characteristics of the folds. And you can tell I have very little paint on my bristle, and I'm just kind of rubbing it on the high points, and this will bring out some texture. This also brings out a little bit of the more detail of the paper. Because it accentuates like the imperfections of the tissue paper, like the folds, and that's kind of the effect that you want, is you're trying to get some of that, those imperfections to be a little bit more accentuated. So what I'm doing now is I'm actually adding an additional color just to make this look a little bit more weathered look, which will be perfect for my Wabi Sabi art journal, which is what I plan on using that for. And the thing is, you can play with the little corners, and I'm going to actually add a little bit watered down in here. Because we're kind of going for that imperfect look, which is the Wabi Sabi look. And I like that how it kind of outlines a little bit of the string. A little bit more too. Now this is, adding different colors. This is a layering effect to try to just add a little bit more character to your paper. Because sometimes what happens is it ends up looking flat, and what I'm doing is I'm exaggerating some of those details of this paper. Okay, so then you can even go back, and this is part of the mixed media approach, is that you can add and subtract, right? So if you feel like, well, you know what, I have a little bit too much dark areas, I am actually going to go back and add a little bit more color in some areas. And this is really just, this is really just starting to look yummy in some areas. Okay. Very cool. So that is how you do fabric paper, and I have, this is the other version of the fabric paper, so that I could provide you guys two types of techniques to make fabric paper. Because this is also flexible, like I showed in the other video, that it actually is now still flexible. Okay, so there you go.